Maryland was still reeling from the yellow fever epidemic when a new hope emerged, the Walsh Medical Institute. Led by the charismatic Dr. Elijah Walsh, the dynasty promised free care for the poor, the enslaved, and the mentally ill. People lined up for miles outside the gates, desperate for healing. But within months, whispers spread. Patients entered and never came out. Families were told their loved ones had relapsed, escaped, or succumbed to fever. But no bodies were returned, no funerals held. One woman claimed she saw her brother tied to a gurney in the basement. Another said she heard screams beneath the chapel floor. By 1803, over 300 people had disappeared inside the Walsh facility. What was really happening behind those whitewashed doors? Who protected the Walsh family from legal consequences? And why did the U.S. government step in to seal the records, permanently? This is not just a story of medical ambition. It's a story of human experimentation, power, and a family's descent into madness. Stay with us as we uncover America's most horrific medical scandal, and what it reveals about the price of progress. Subscribe now to never miss a story this dark again. Capitulo 1. The house on the hill. The Walsh estate sat on a hill above Elk Ridge, its silhouette cutting sharp against the sky. Built of limestone and dark timber, the mansion looked more like a fortress than a home. Locals whispered that its architect had gone mad during construction, insisting on secret corridors, bricked-up rooms, and iron doors with no keys. But it wasn't the house itself that made people uneasy. It was the people inside. Dr. Elijah Walsh had returned from Europe in 1797 after studying medicine in Edinburgh and Paris. He brought with him surgical techniques no one in Maryland had seen before: blood transfusions, trephinations, crude anesthesia methods using laudanum and belladonna. In his public lectures, he spoke passionately of scientific advancement, often quoting Galen and Descartes. But what set him apart wasn't just knowledge. It was the money. The Walsh family, already wealthy from shipping and tobacco, had poured a fortune into building the Walsh Medical Institute, a stone structure behind the main house, officially registered as a charitable hospital. The elite applauded the effort. The newspapers called Elijah a visionary. The governor praised him for offering the blessings of science to the unfortunate. But the poor whispered a different story. The first to vanish was a young black boy named Thomas. His mother had taken him to the institute for a fever. She was told to wait in the courtyard. Hours passed. Then a nurse told her Thomas had been moved to an isolation ward and she could no longer see him. Days later she returned, demanding answers. The nurse handed her a small wooden box. Inside was a lock of hair and a note that read, "He passed peacefully. No body. No explanation." She wasn't the only one. A group of Irish immigrants reported their elderly father missing after treatment at the institute. A group of Quaker women who volunteered at the hospital quit suddenly, refusing to speak of what they had seen. A freedman named Harold claimed he was kept overnight for observation, and awoke restrained, a strange burning sensation in his chest. When he escaped, there was a vertical scar below his collarbone. He was never seen in town again. By the winter of 1799, stories had grown too numerous to ignore. But Elijah always had answers. "This is a difficult time in medicine," he would say. "We do what we can to relieve suffering. But not every case ends in success." Behind closed doors, the Walsh family tightened their circle. Elijah's younger brother, Nathaniel, was a chemist with a cruel intellect and no bedside manner. He oversaw the storage of substances, opium, mercury, arsenic, often in quantities that raised eyebrows among suppliers. Their sister, Rebecca Walsh, rarely spoke in public. But within the institute she was feared. Nurses called her La Viuda Blanca, the White Widow, for her habit of appearing silently behind people and her obsession with purity of mind through pain. She ran the institute's mental ward and often pushed for moral corrections, through cold water immersion and isolation. The matriarch, Eleanor Walsh, was never seen outside the estate. But patients sometimes described a pale woman with glassy eyes hovering in their rooms at night, whispering prayers in Latin and humming lullabies no one recognized. The family operated like a closed system. They hired only immigrants, former convicts, and runaways as staff, people who wouldn't ask questions or be missed. They claimed it was charity. Others called it strategy. Then came Dr. Samuel Pike, a recent graduate from Baltimore who accepted a post at the Institute, unaware of its true nature. In a letter to his cousin, dated March 1800, he wrote, "The Walshes are brilliant, yes, but I cannot ignore what I've seen. Experiments conducted on the mentally ill, cutting, probing, bleeding. All done in the name of discovery. I voiced concern, but they call me weak. I fear I will not last here long." The letter was never sent. Pike's body was found hanging from the second-floor rafters. The coroner ruled it suicide. His journal, however, was missing. It wasn't until a fire broke out in one of the estate's barns that authorities were forced to intervene. Firefighters stumbled upon a hidden trapdoor beneath the hay. It led to a stone tunnel, and at its end, a chamber filled with surgical tables, restraints, and shallow graves. Some bones were child-sized. Others bore signs of dissection. Dr. Walsh claimed it was a forgotten part of the original foundation. A misunderstanding. A slanderous attack by jealous rivals. No charges were filed. The case was sealed by order of the governor, in the interest of public calm. But rumors spread further now, traveling beyond Maryland, carried by sailors and travelers. They spoke of a house on the hill where screams echoed through the trees. A clinic where no one came out whole. A dynasty that believed the human body was just another puzzle to solve, no matter how many had to die in the process. And this was only the beginning. By spring of 1800, the Walsh Institute had become a paradox in the region. Publicly praised, privately feared. The elite of Annapolis and Baltimore continued to fund it, sending donations and patients alike, especially those deemed too difficult or unfit for society. Among these were epileptics, women suffering from hysteria, the elderly with dementia, and war veterans plagued by hallucinations. The Walshes welcomed them all, with open arms and closed doors. Inside, the Institute's corridors grew darker in more ways than one. Lighting was scarce, and the air smelled of lye and formaldehyde. Nurses were instructed not to speak to patients unless spoken to, and every night at 9, bells rang 3 times, signaling the cleansing hour. No one outside the family knew what happened during that hour, but afterward, the hallways would fill with muffled sobs and the stench of burned cloth. One attendant, a teenage girl named Liddy, managed to escape after working only 2 weeks. She fled barefoot into the woods and was found half-starved at a farmstead 10 miles south. Her story made it briefly into a local paper before it was retracted. In her interview she said, "They put something in the water. Patients would sleep all day and scream all night. And sometimes they woke up sewn shut." When pressed, she refused to elaborate. Her family moved away shortly after. Meanwhile, Elijah Walsh expanded his influence. He published articles in scientific journals, delivered lectures at the College of Philadelphia, and was even rumored to be advising members of the new federal government on medical matters. To critics, he presented numbers, charts of recovery rates, lists of cured cases, and endorsements from important men. But his numbers didn't include the undocumented. In 1801, a traveling preacher named Ezekiel Moore claimed to have seen mass graves in the woods behind the estate, shallow pits covered in lime, each marked only by a stone. He led a group of farmers to investigate, but the Walshes intercepted them. The men were arrested for trespassing and charged with attempted theft of private medical property. Moore died of fever 3 weeks later in custody. That summer, an outbreak of typhus swept through Maryland. While most towns suffered heavy losses, the Walsh Institute reported remarkable success. Dozens of patients were admitted. Only 6 were reported dead. No one could verify the number because no one outside was allowed into the records room. Then one night in October, a scream rang out from the western wing of the estate, so loud it reached the town below. Witnesses say it sounded like a child. 2 days later, the Walshes announced that the west wing had suffered a small fire and would be closed for repairs. Black smoke was seen for hours and strange fumes drifted down the hill, making some townsfolk ill. A teacher named Mrs. Eliza Barton claimed the smoke smelled of hair, flesh, and something sweet, like rotting fruit. By now the town had split in two. Some believed the Walshes were misunderstood geniuses, vilified by the ignorant. Others were convinced they were monsters hiding behind science. But neither side had proof, only stories, and the stories were terrifying. In early 1802, a Boston-based journalist named Calvin Drew arrived in Elk Ridge. He said he was writing a piece on medical miracles of the New Republic. But his real goal was to investigate the rumors he'd heard from sailors who'd passed through Baltimore. He checked into the local inn and began his research. 3 weeks later, he vanished. His trunk was found in his room. Inside were journals, sketches of the Walsh property, and a letter addressed to his editor. "If you receive this, know that I believe the truth is far worse than anything I imagined. The Walshes are not healers. They are collectors of pain, of silence, of flesh." The letter was unsigned. The story never ran. The editor claimed he never received it. But copies circulated, handwritten, secret. That letter became known as the Elk Ridge document. It was passed from household to household, fueling fear and speculation. And yet, the Walsh dynasty endured. Because those in power protected them. Because science excused them. And because the bodies somehow always disappeared. Capitulo 2, the Surgical Theater. In the spring of 1803, under a false name, a young man named Abner Keller was admitted to the Walsh Institute. He claimed to suffer from debilitating migraines and spiritual visions. In truth, he was a seminarian turned investigator, sent by a secret consortium of clergymen concerned by the increasing number of parishioners who had vanished after entering the institute. Abner carried no weapon, only a small leather Bible, a hollowed-out crucifix concealing graphite for writing, and a pendant locket containing a sketch of his younger sister, who had died at the hands of a negligent doctor. He had reason to hate medicine, but he had more reason to uncover the truth. He quickly discovered that the institute functioned on a strict caste system. Patients were divided by status. The salvageable were housed in upper chambers, while the uncurables were taken to the basement for experimental therapies. Abner feigned docility, scribbling notes at night in the margins of his psalms, recording every scream, every strange scent, every name he heard through the walls. It was in the second week that he learned about the theater. According to whispers, beneath the main infirmary was a sealed amphitheater used only at night. Patients were taken down blindfolded, sedated with laudanum, and returned days later, if at all. Some came back mute. Others with partial amputations or crude stitches across the scalp. One man, a former soldier named Boone, had been subjected to trepanation, a hole drilled into his skull to release demons. When Abner asked him what he remembered, Boone simply wept and clawed at his temple, repeating the word voice. Determined to see the theater with his own eyes, Abner began slipping from his cot after midnight. He discovered that the hallways had no guards, only closed doors and the ever-present scent of iodine. On his fourth night, he found a locked wooden door behind the apothecary labeled simply, Observatio. He marked the hinges with wax, waiting for the night it would open. That night came sooner than expected. A nurse named Miriam, a jittery woman with shaking hands, was reprimanded for mislabeling a tincture. As punishment, she was ordered to observe a procedure in the theater. Abner watched from a corner as she was escorted down the corridor, pale and trembling. She didn't return until dawn. Her white uniform was soaked in brown fluid. Her shoes were missing. And when Abner tried to speak to her, she stared at him with hollow eyes and whispered, "They listen to the bones. They believe the marrow remembers." That morning, Miriam flung herself from the upper landing of the stairwell. Her body broke against the marble tiles. The Walshes claimed it was an epileptic episode. But the patients knew better. One man, Mr. Davies, began scratching drawings into the walls of his cell. A circular chamber with iron restraints, rows of wooden benches, and a table surrounded by mirrors. Above it all he etched an eye, open, lidless, dripping. Meanwhile, Elijah Walsh had announced the Institute's next stage of evolution. A new surgical curriculum open to select apprentices, where they would redefine human limits. Invitations were sent to promising students from New York, Charleston, and even as far as London. Among them was Dr. Julian Vey, a renowned anatomist known for dissecting corpses retrieved from shipwrecks. He arrived with 2 trunks, one filled with books and the other with preserved organs, each labeled with the donor's name, age and last words. With Vay's arrival, the theater's use increased. Every 3rd night, the bells rang not 3 but 5 times. Nurses stopped making eye contact, and patients began to disappear in batches, whole wings emptied, names erased from records. Abner finally gained access on the 28th of June. Disguised as a groundskeeper, he followed a group of orderlies carrying a stretcher through the back tunnels. They descended into a stone shaft lit only by oil lamps. At the bottom was a heavy door, reinforced with copper and marked by a crimson handprint. What he saw inside haunted every word he would later write. The theater was circular, just as the drawings described. It reeked of vinegar and death. In the center, a naked boy no older than 12 lay strapped to a metal slab. Around him stood Elijah, Rebecca, Nathaniel, and Vay, all wearing black coats, hands gloved, eyes wild with anticipation. They weren't performing surgery. They were extracting something, a segment of the spine or perhaps tissue from the brain. But their focus wasn't on healing. It was on reaction. They took notes as the boy convulsed, as his mouth formed silent screams. Rebecca whispered, "This is where God lives," while pressing 2 fingers to the child's sternum. Abner fled. He nearly didn't make it out. One of the orderlies spotted him, and he was forced to stab the man with a broken scalpel and escape through the drainage tunnel. He emerged 2 miles outside the estate, soaked in blood and bile. He walked barefoot to the nearest parish and collapsed. The church took him in and recorded his testimony, but they knew no court in Maryland would act on it. The Walsh name was too powerful, too respected, and too dangerous. So the church did what they could. They buried his notes, sealed the documents, and transferred Abner to a monastery in Vermont, where he lived the rest of his life in silence. But the theater did not stop. It grew, and its echoes still lingered beneath the soil of Elk Ridge. In the months following Abner's escape, the Walsh family took measures to fortify their secrets. All windows in the lower wings were sealed with bricks. Visitors were no longer allowed past the front reception area. Letters sent by patients were intercepted, rewritten, or discarded entirely. And a new consent form was introduced, signed by family members upon admission, granting full discretion to the institute regarding treatment and release. But the local population was restless. Livestock were found mutilated near the estate boundaries. Children spoke of masked figures watching them from the tree line. A group of farmers attempted to file a formal complaint with the county magistrate, citing illegal burial grounds and missing family members. The complaint was dismissed. Then came the plague room. In late 1803, a former housemaid named Bessina, dismissed after suffering seizures, began suffering hallucinations. She claimed she saw rows of corpses lined up in a hidden chamber behind the old chapel, with wax plugs in their ears and mouths sewn shut. She called it the plague room, though no one knew why. When she was found drowned in her own bathtub, authorities ruled it an accident. But among her possessions was a folded sheet of paper with one line scrawled in red ink. "They never die, they just sleep." It was the first time outsiders began to wonder if the Walsh's practices weren't merely criminal, but unnatural. The rumors intensified when local dogs began digging up bones behind the estate, bones too clean to be animal. Several had surgical notches, pins still lodged in sockets, or teeth extracted. A young boy brought a skull to church one Sunday, mistaking it for a relic. The priest fainted. Still, Elijah Walsh maintained public support. He donated funds for a new orphanage, commissioned portraits for the local school, and even hosted a public charity banquet at the estate, his first event open to outsiders in years. But the guests were not allowed to roam. Each was assigned an escort. No one was permitted to enter the east wing. When a colonel's wife attempted to open a door marked chapel storage, she was politely but firmly removed from the premises. That same night, a storm hit Elk Ridge. Lightning struck the estate's southern tower, igniting a fire that burned for hours. Villagers rushed up the hill to help, but were turned away by armed guards newly hired from out of state. Flames lit up the sky and screams, distinct, human, were heard until sunrise. By morning, the Walshes claimed it had been a storage accident. The fire had destroyed all paper records from the past decade. The following week, 5 graves were dug behind the chapel. Simple wooden markers, no names, just numbers. 43, 44, 45, 46, 47. When a journalist inquired, Elijah said they were anonymous benefactors. No one believed him. Among the townsfolk a silent pact formed: do not speak of the Walshes. Do not point. Do not ask. If you fall ill, go elsewhere. Let those who enter the institute do so alone. But in secret, resistance stirred. A group of midwives, ex-nurses and freedmen began to collect stories, written in cipher, exchanged in baskets of bread or sewn into jacket linings. They called themselves the Quiet Hands. Their goal: gather enough evidence to shut down the institute forever, and to uncover what exactly lay beneath the stone floor of the theater. Capitulo 3: The Quiet Hands. The movement began with a whisper and a midwife. Her name was Henrietta Graves, and she had once trained under a surgeon in Philadelphia before being forced out of medicine due to her gender. She moved to Elk Ridge to tend to births and smallpox outbreaks, until she lost her niece, a young girl named Miriam, to the Walsh Institute in 1801. Miriam had gone in for a fever and never came out. Henrietta knew the story wasn't new. But what made her act was what she received 1 month after Miriam's supposed passing. A brown paper package containing a jawbone, small enough to be a child's, with 2 molars missing and initials scratched inside with a pin, M.G. Miriam Graves. That was the first piece of evidence. The second came from a washerwoman named Dorcas, who had worked 1 season inside the Institute's laundry. She spoke of sheets that came down not just bloodied, but stiff with something darker, something black, thick, like burned oil. She said she once found a finger in a doctor's coat pocket. When she reported it, the nurse laughed and said, "That's from the old ward. We use them for training." Dorcas quit the next day. But she remembered every face. The third member was Ezekiel, a freedman and former assistant to Dr. Vey. He had been trained to prepare cadavers for study, cleaning, preserving, positioning. What disturbed him was not the bodies but the breathing. He claimed some subjects were not dead when the procedures began. He heard groans through stitched mouths. One woman, whose leg he was asked to remove, opened her eyes and mouthed, "No." Vey told him it was a muscular reflex. But Ezekiel knew otherwise. He left the institute after 1 year and never spoke again, except to Henrietta. Together they formed the Quiet Hands. They operated in secret, gathering fragments. A severed toe with tattooed numbers, a broken rosary clutched in the hand of a body dumped near the river, a note from a patient named Edward C., smuggled out in the hem of a pillowcase. The note read, "They wake me for the blue light. I dream of knives. Rebecca hums when she cuts." It was clear that the Institute's victims were not just forgotten. They were collected, reused, re-entered into experiments, kept alive by unnatural means. In 1804, the Quiet Hands intercepted a wagon meant to transport medical refuse to a burn site. Inside were 6 bodies, 3 children, 2 men and 1 woman, none of them dead. They were paralyzed, sedated but responsive. 1 child blinked in Morse when Henrietta squeezed his hand. The group had to make a choice. They relocated the survivors to a makeshift cellar in the town's bakery. There, Ezekiel and Henrietta tended to them in secret. 3 died within weeks from internal damage. But one, a man named George Darrow, began to speak. His first words, "They wanted my dreams." George described strange sessions in the theater. He was injected with mercury and forced into sensory deprivation for days. The Walshes believed dreams were biological residues, that memories could be harvested from the dying and infused into others. George was one of many they tried to reprogram. His last treatment involved removing part of his occipital lobe. He could no longer see color. When Henrietta pressed him for more, George began to scratch symbols into the wall. Spirals, eyes, bleeding hearts, and 1 word repeated in crude block letters. Marrow. Henrietta believed this was the key. That same year, she broke into the estate under cover of fog. She had learned from Dorcas which window was left ajar for the kitchen chimney. She slipped inside, torch in hand, and made her way toward the archives. She found them deep in the east wing behind a hidden panel in the study. What she discovered would become the foundation of the case against the Walsh family, though no court would ever admit it. In a series of black-bound ledgers, she found case numbers without names. Just notes. Subject 12, spleen removed during REM state. Result, laughter. Subject 30, auditory hallucination induction via ear drilling. Result, false memory creation successful. Subject 48, infusion of maternal marrow into unrelated minor. Result, seizure, vocal repetition of unknown words. Subject 69, self-immolation after cranial nerve resection. Asterisk. Each entry ended with the same phrase. Theory holds. Repeat with variation. Henrietta took 3 volumes and escaped before dawn. She presented them to a local priest, hoping for moral support. Instead, he begged her to destroy them. Some knowledge, he said, is an infection. But she didn't stop. She published excerpts in underground broadsheets. Sent copies to Boston, Philadelphia, and London. She wrote under the name H.G. Lumen and signed each dispatch with a handprint in soot. Soon people came looking for her. The Walshes placed a bounty, unofficial of course. Men in dark coats asked for her by name. One night, her home was burned to the ground. She survived, but only barely, hidden by the townspeople who had once feared her. And in the shadows, the Institute retaliated. They offered free treatment for all veterans of the Revolutionary War. Hundreds enrolled. Most never came home. By the end of 1804, the quiet hands had grown from a small resistance into a full network. Bakers, teachers, ex-orderlies, even 2 local grave diggers who claimed they were paid by the Institute to bury empty caskets. They began to meet in the church basement, smuggling pages from the ledgers, medical tools with strange modifications, and personal artifacts of missing patients. The group operated under a vow: we name the lost. They created a wall of names inside the church, scrawled in charcoal. Miriam Graves, Edward C., Thomas P., Samuel Pike, George Darrow, Liddy Hart, Boone Harold. More than 100 names by Christmas of that year. Then one day the wall was found scrubbed clean. No sign of forced entry. No soot on the floor. Just a single message etched into the stone above where the names had been. None are lost. All remain. The next week, one of the midwives, Ruth Lang, disappeared. Her body was found hanging from the gate of the Institute, her mouth sewn shut and hands folded as if in prayer. She had been 5 months pregnant. The sheriff called it suicide. The town knew better. The message was clear. Yet, despite the terror, Henrietta made a choice that would seal her place in the town's cursed history. She decided to infiltrate the Institute one final time, not to escape with evidence but to bring someone out. That someone was Rebecca Walsh. Henrietta believed, from the documents and testimonies, that Rebecca wasn't like the others. That she hadn't always been cruel. That perhaps she was broken or brainwashed, or had become a prisoner herself inside the family's machine. There were even rumors that Rebecca had once helped a child escape through the laundry chute. On the night of January 3, 1805, Henrietta used forged documents to gain access to the Institute as a nurse. She cut her hair, wore wire-rimmed glasses, and took the name Anna Lark. Her plan was to observe, locate Rebecca's chambers, and make contact. For 3 nights, she slept in a cot beside comatose patients, mopped floors stained with blood that never quite washed out, and served broth to silent men with vacant eyes. On the 4th night, she found the theater again. It was worse than she remembered. The walls now bore frescoes, medical diagrams of anatomy, eyes blooming from skulls, fetuses curled around strings of Latin scripture. The table in the center had been replaced with something larger. A steel bed with a cage over it. There were tubes, saws, and a bell jar containing what looked like a preserved spinal cord still twitching slightly. That was when she saw Rebecca, dressed in gray, standing at the far end of the chamber, humming. Her eyes were glassy, her mouth slightly open as if in trance. In her hand she held a crucifix-shaped scalpel. Henrietta approached slowly and whispered, "Miriam was my niece." Rebecca blinked once. Then she said softly, "I told her to hide in the dumbwaiter." It was all the proof Henrietta needed. There was still someone human inside her. But before she could speak again, alarms rang through the walls. Rebecca's eyes sharpened. She turned to Henrietta and said, "They're watching now. You have to run. Don't come back. The dead are not at rest." Henrietta fled through the laundry shaft, losing her forged ID and slicing her leg on exposed wire. She was found crawling in the forest 2 days later, feverish and hallucinating. She had one object in her coat pocket, a rosary made of teeth. After her rescue, Henrietta vanished from public life. Some say she was taken in by Jesuits. Others claim she wandered into the woods and built a cabin where she continued writing in secret. Her final recorded words in a letter smuggled to the quiet hands were, "The marrow remembers. The bones speak. The family endures." That same year, the Walsh Institute was granted a new charter, endorsed by a delegation from Washington, D.C., calling it a model for future medical innovation. The quiet hands dissolved shortly after. Its members either died, disappeared, or were discredited. But the ledgers remained, hidden, preserved, waiting. And beneath the house on the hill, the theater lights never truly went out. Capitulo 4, The Bloodline Experiment. By 1806, the Walsh family was no longer just a name, they were a legacy. With official protections, political allies, and enough fear to silence a county, the institute expanded. A second structure was built further down the hill, referred to only as the nursery. It did not appear on public maps. Supplies were delivered at night. No patient was ever recorded entering or leaving. The nursery wasn't for healing. It was for breeding. Documents later recovered would suggest the Walshes had begun a new phase of experimentation, not on the sick, but on the unborn. They believed that fear, pain, and trauma could alter human physiology in utero. That if they subjected pregnant women to intense psychological and physical stress, they could birth children with altered cognition, more sensitive to memory extraction, more receptive to empathic transfer. The term they used was hollowing. Pregnant women were selected carefully, mostly mentally ill, mostly without family. They were sedated during conception, confined to soundless, windowless rooms, and injected with emotional regulators. Some gave birth. Most did not. One child who survived was later identified as Subject E, a boy with heterochromia and a distinct surgical scar across his spine. Witnesses claimed he could recite passages from books he had never read, mimic the voice of any adult after hearing them once, and would cry uncontrollably at the sight of blood, even before he was taught what it was. He was 6 years old when he vanished from the record. Some believe he was taken to Washington. Others think he never left the basement. But the program didn't stop there. Elijah Walsh, now graying and gaunter than ever, began to speak openly of biological continuity, the theory that consciousness could be genetically inherited, that with the right surgical sequencing and soul anchoring, one could pass not just memory but intent across generations. He wrote in his final publication, Sanguis Voluntatis, "The child is the future not because it is young but because it is moldable. Pain is the scalpel of inheritance." His theories gained traction in certain medical circles. A few fringe physicians adopted his methods, often secretly. One was later executed in South Carolina for dissecting living slaves in the name of genetic revelation. Another was run out of Montreal for a failed attempt to grow emotionless twins. The Walsh Institute, meanwhile, became more insular. By 1810 they had ceased accepting public patients altogether. The estate was closed to outsiders, and only select partners were allowed correspondence. Townsfolk reported seeing large crates delivered by covered wagon, marked with initials and numbers but no return address. One man swore he saw a child's face pressed against the slats of a box, but when he returned with a deputy, the wagon was gone. And then came the gray spring. In April 1811, every tree on the hill behind the Walsh estate began to wither. Leaves turned ash-colored. Birds avoided the area. The soil beneath the eastern orchard cracked open, revealing what appeared to be tunnels, black with mold and lined with bone. The estate responded by erecting a wall, 12 feet high, with a copper inlay said to prevent contamination. But the damage had been done. People began to dream. Not just one or two villagers, entire families, clergy, children. They spoke of a child with one green and one black eye. Of a chapel filled with glass jars and whispering teeth. Of a woman in gray holding a book with no words, pointing toward their chests. One child drew a map in chalk. It matched the underground structure of the Walsh estate perfectly. That child, Iris Boone, vanished 2 weeks later. Her parents found her window open, a handprint of soot on the glass and a needle on the floor. Not a sewing needle, a surgical one. The quiet hands had long since dissolved, but their documents found new readers, collectors, skeptics, underground scholars. And the more they studied, the more one name reappeared. Rebecca. Some said she had died. Others claimed she had gone mad and was confined to a glass room at the bottom of the theater. A few whispered that she had outlived all the others. That she had become the heart of the house. One thing was certain, no one had seen her in over a decade. Until 1813, when a farmer's daughter named Elsie Carter was found wandering the woods near the estate, naked, bruised, and babbling in Latin. She was 12. She claimed to be the granddaughter of Elijah Walsh. But Elijah had no known children. Elsie described a woman in white who visited her each night in the nursery, who placed a hand on her head and whispered, "You carry the marrow now." She had scars on her stomach and spine. She also had a brand on her left shoulder, an eye with a drop of blood beneath it. The brand matched the seal on the Walsh family crest. Elsie died 3 days later of septic shock. Her body was taken by federal agents. The family was never contacted. The town of Elk Ridge went silent after that. The estate remained, its curtains drawn, its windows dark. In 1815, a fire swept through the eastern wing, but no emergency services were called. No one tried to stop it. When it was over, the structure still stood, but something about it looked older, heavier, as if the flames had revealed something underneath. That year, 4 new gravestones appeared behind the chapel. No names, just dates. 1811, 1812, 1813, 1815. Locals began calling it the house that bled. And still, no one entered, because by then everyone knew. The Walshes weren't just conducting experiments. They were becoming them. In the years that followed, strange phenomena surrounded the Walsh estate. Livestock stillborn with fused limbs. Lightning that struck only the weather vane atop the house, 5 times in one night. Dogs would not approach the property line. Children who walked too close reported hearing piano music, even though no one had lived there, publicly, for years. Then came the census man. In 1816, a government official named Cornelius Wex arrived to perform a routine population count. He was meticulous and skeptical by nature. A veteran of the Revolution, he had seen enough death to know when something didn't smell right. He visited Elk Ridge and immediately noticed something off. No one would speak of the Walsh estate. Not even the mayor. Curious, he approached the property on foot. He described the gates as quietly breathing, a trick of wind, perhaps, or nerves. He rang the bell. A child answered. She was no more than 7. Her eyes were milky, her skin translucent. She spoke in full, articulate sentences and introduced herself as Dr. Walsh. When Wex chuckled and asked if her parents were home, she said, "They're asleep, but I can show you the library." He declined, excused himself, and left in haste. That night he wrote in his journal, "There are no Walshes left, only echoes wearing their skin." Cornelius Wex never submitted his census report. 3 months later he was found in a Boston asylum, blind and catatonic. On his forearm were 2 words carved by hand. "She knows." The government made one final attempt to intervene. In 1817, a federal medical envoy was sent to the institute under the pretext of investigating unauthorized anatomical study. 5 men went in. 2 returned. Their report was sealed immediately. Unofficially, one of the survivors spoke to a clergyman, saying, "It wasn't a hospital. It wasn't even a place. It was something wearing the shape of a house. And beneath it, something still living." That was the last official record. After that, the Walsh name disappeared from all registries. The estate was removed from property tax rolls. Cartographers stopped marking it. The town of Elk Ridge quietly shrank until it became a ghost village. What families remained did so out of inertia, fear, or because they had nowhere else to go. And the house remained. Watching. Capitulo 5, Whispers in the Marrow. By 1820, the Walsh estate was no longer part of Maryland. Not legally, not spiritually. Travelers who passed through Elk Ridge described it as a town with no pulse. Shops abandoned mid-sale, churches left open with candles still burning, windows covered in bedsheets, as if to hide from something that didn't knock. The estate, however, still stood. No one entered. But lights flickered behind the windows at night, blue, red, flickering as though powered by something other than oil or flame. That same year, a new family moved to the outskirts of town. The Briggs, originally from Virginia, had heard rumors but dismissed them as superstition. They were practical people. Farmers. But within weeks, their livestock grew sick, their children suffered nosebleeds, and Mrs. Briggs reported hearing a woman's voice whispering inside her walls. The youngest daughter, May, vanished one night from her bed. She was found the next morning at the edge of the Walsh property, seated cross-legged in a clearing, holding a dead bird in her lap. Her eyes were rolled back. When her mother screamed and lifted her, May whispered, "I know how they die." The Briggs fled that same afternoon. Their story reached Baltimore, where it was largely mocked, until one man took interest. Dr. Jonas Bellamy, a neurologist from Boston, had long been obsessed with the rumors surrounding the Walsh family. He considered them not monsters but pioneers, pushed to extremes by ambition. He traveled to Elk Ridge alone, carrying only a medical bag and a manuscript titled Neurogenetic Transference, a speculative theory. He was never seen again. But his manuscript was found, intact, on the steps of a seminary in Annapolis 3 months later. In it, he described a singular discovery, that the Walsh family had likely succeeded in creating a new form of memory, one encoded not in neurons but in bone marrow, capable of transmitting trauma, knowledge, and sensory imprints genetically. He theorized that marrow, unlike blood, could retain emotive instructions, and pass them on if manipulated properly. He called it emotive heredity. In the margins, scrawled in ink different from the original writing, someone had added a line. It grows stronger in children. The manuscript was suppressed, but not before it was copied. In 1823, a series of anonymous pamphlets appeared in New York City under the pseudonym ALW. Each pamphlet bore a black handprint and a Latin motto. Dolor semper habet filium, pain always has a daughter. Inside were descriptions of surgical rituals, memory farming, and diagrams of the theater that matched those drawn decades earlier by Edward C. and Henrietta Graves. No one knew who ALW was. Some believed it to be Rebecca Walsh herself, writing from wherever she now lived, or perhaps from within the house itself. Others believed ALW stood for Amalgamated Legacy of Walsh, a cult of medical descendants who had inherited not only the estate but the knowledge. That same year, a preacher named Enoch Stiles organized a raid on the property with 12 armed men. They approached at dawn with torches and rope, determined to salt the soil and burn the curse. None returned. But that night, 12 trees on the hill caught fire. No wind. No storm. Just spontaneous combustion, each flame forming a ring around the estate. Locals said they heard crying from inside the trunks. After that, no one tried again. By 1830, the Walsh estate had become folklore. But still, strange letters arrived in the town's abandoned post office. No stamp, no return address. Always postmarked with a single symbol, an open eye above a house. Inside only one phrase. The marrow remembers. And so do we. In 1831, an out-of-print medical journal resurfaced in a London archive. Tucked between articles on bone lesions and phrenology was a handwritten addendum, unsigned, written in iron gall ink. It recounted a procedure observed at an unregistered American facility, involving a marrow transfusion between a dying mother and her unborn child. The note claimed the child was born, already grieving. A year later, the body of a French anatomist named Dr. Baptiste Chevalier was found in the Thames. His lungs were filled with wax. In his coat was a page torn from the same journal, marked with a single line. Walsh knew. Meanwhile, in Elk Ridge, time began to dislocate. Locals said clocks stopped working near the estate. Roosters crowed at midnight. Ice formed on windows during summer. One boy returned home after being lost for 2 hours in the woods behind the Walsh property, only he had grown a beard, and his hands were wrinkled like a man of 50. When asked what happened, he replied, "The room had no floor. Just memories." The town sealed itself off. No roads were maintained. Mail routes were restructured to bypass it entirely. Eventually, Elk Ridge vanished from maps. The federal government issued no explanation, only that the region was uninhabitable due to geological instability. But people kept disappearing. Vagrants, orphans, escaped prisoners, drawn by something. Some said they were called. One woman, arrested in Delaware after carving Walsh symbols into her arms, said, "I was born from someone else's suffering. I just want to go home." Investigators dismissed her as insane. But in 1837, a team of surveyors accidentally uncovered a new entrance, a tunnel leading into the hill beneath the estate. Inside they found bone fragments arranged like alphabetic runes, a chair with iron restraints, and a child's voice recorded on a wax cylinder, repeating in Latin, "My body is borrowed. My memory is not mine." The cylinder was lost en route to Washington. 2 months later, the lead surveyor was found in his bathtub with his eyes stitched open and his tongue missing. In his hand, a tooth. By the 1840s, the Walsh Institute was a ghost to the nation, but a living wound to those who remembered. A collective formed, scholars, occultists, underground physicians, devoted to decoding the legacy. They called themselves the Marrow Society. Their aim was to locate surviving documents, identify patients who had escaped, and map the hereditary trauma encoded in their descendants. Their most damning discovery was a birth registry from 1809. It listed 24 unnamed infants born within the institute, each with medical annotations. Subject A, responsive to hymnal tones. Subject D, accelerated tooth growth. Subject M, dreams in duplicate. Subject X, no shadow observed. None of the infants were legally registered. None were ever adopted. The implication was clear. The Walshes had not simply studied memory, they had bred vessels to carry it. And somewhere the lineage continued. That same year, a letter surfaced in a private archive in Philadelphia. It was addressed to the one who remembers, and signed again ALW. The final lines read, "You'll know them by their silence. You'll know them by the way they look at pain. They are not like us, but they were made from us." Capitulo 6, The Silent Inheritance. By 1850, the name Walsh had become taboo in academic circles. Medical students whispered of the family as cautionary myth, pioneers who went too far. Professors refused to acknowledge the legacy, yet footnotes in anatomy texts mysteriously cited uncredited Elk Ridge protocols. Surgeons used techniques without knowing their origins. Tools designed by Elijah and Nathaniel Walsh, once etched with a stylized eye, were now sold under different names, repurposed but intact. The work had not stopped. It had simply changed hands. In the mid-1850s, a young doctor named Lemuel Hartley published a paper on memory transfer in trauma patients. He described how certain amputees reported ancestral dreams, visions of events they had never lived. When asked where he trained, Hartley said only, "The archives beneath the hill." He was discredited and vanished shortly after. But his case inspired a wave of interest among fringe psychologists. A German neurologist, Dr. Weber, wrote in his diaries that trauma could be imprinted like ink into marrow. A Russian pathologist created a map of the nervous system that mirrored the layout of the Walsh theater chamber. None of them cited the family. But all of them repeated one phrase: "The marrow remembers." Meanwhile, in Elk Ridge, the estate had become ruinous. The roof sagged. Ivy swallowed the western wing. Crows nested in the windows. And yet, lamplight was seen in the highest tower each night at exactly 3:33 a.m. No one investigated. The property, according to land records, was now owned by no one. That didn't stop people from visiting. In 1861, during the first year of the Civil War, Union soldiers passing through the region reported hearing cries from underground. One regiment camped a mile from the estate and woke to find their horses dead, eyes wide open, necks twisted toward the house. The army forbade further encampments in the area. But one soldier, Private Emery Vance, returned after the war with a team of surveyors, convinced the estate held Confederate medical experiments. He brought dynamite, blueprints, and hired men with picks. Only 2 made it out alive. They claimed the tunnels beneath the house were shifting. Rooms that changed size, stairs that vanished, doors that led to the same hallway again and again. One said he saw a child in a surgeon's mask, humming, floating 2 inches off the ground. The project was abandoned. Private Vance was committed to a sanatorium where he screamed every morning at 3:33 a.m. until his death. By 1870, reports of sightings increased, not just of the house but of descendants. A girl born in West Virginia with a full set of teeth and a forked tongue. A boy in Boston who wrote medical diagrams in his sleep. A set of twins in Illinois who never spoke but mirrored each other's movements precisely, even while apart. All were found to have spinal anomalies. All had a drop-shaped scar at the base of the neck. None had known connection to the Walsh family. But all were adopted. A midwife in Maryland, near the ruins of Elk Ridge, told a traveling priest she had once delivered a child with glass eyes, real glass, embedded in the socket since birth. The baby had no heartbeat, but breathed steadily for 12 minutes before silently dying. Its final expression was a smile. In 1875, a final attempt was made to demolish the estate. A team of hired laborers set fire to every wing, every floor. The house burned for 3 days. On the 4th morning, the flames vanished, and the house was still standing. Only the front door was gone. And in its place, carved into the stone threshold. You cannot bury memory. That same year, a sealed box was found in the archives of Johns Hopkins University. No one knew how it arrived. Inside were 47 surgical journals bound in skin-like leather, each signed R.W., and filled with diagrams, rituals, and Latin invocations. The contents were so disturbing they were never catalogued. To this day they remain locked in a vault labeled, Restricted, Walsh Collection. And still, the lights flicker. And still, the door is open. In 1883, a fire broke out in the Elk Ridge Town Hall, one of the last remaining municipal structures. It destroyed decades of local records, including property deeds, birth registries, and town maps. Some called it an accident. Others called it a purge. But not all memory burns. A surviving page, half-scorched and later recovered from the rubble, bore a sketch of the Walsh estate drawn by a schoolchild. In the bottom corner, written in uneven cursive, were the words, "I was born there. But I'm not supposed to say." The child's name was unknown. The page was unsigned. In the following decade, sightings of Rebecca Walsh returned in fragmented reports. A gray-haired woman in Boston who treated burn victims without tools, only with her hands. A blind healer in Tennessee who spoke Latin in her sleep. A librarian in Philadelphia who fainted when she touched a book titled Anatomy of Pain and whispered, "It's not done yet." In all cases, the women disappeared within days of being identified. The most persistent report came from a mental hospital in Virginia, where an elderly patient referred to only as Miss R. claimed to be older than the country. She refused food but recited surgical techniques from memory. She spoke of bones that remembered violence. When asked her last name, she answered, "I am the daughter of Marrow." She died in her sleep. Her body was never found in the morgue. By 1890, the legend of the Walsh Dynasty had dissolved into obscurity. The medical journals no longer printed the name. The estate in Elk Ridge no longer appeared on any map. The region was now considered federal land, preserved for ecological observation. No public explanation was given. But every few years stories resurfaced. A baby born with a necklace of bone. A man who awoke with surgical scars he didn't have the night before. A woman who bled from her eyes whenever she heard a lullaby in a minor key. Each bore no traceable history. Each whispered in sleep. And in every case one phrase returned, scribbled, etched, or spoken aloud. The marrow remembers. That same year, a small package arrived at the Medical College of Edinburgh. It contained no return address, no sender. Inside, a brass key, a piece of paper with a child's handprint in black ink, and a single tooth cracked at the root, wrapped in gauze. The tooth had been dipped in mercury. The package was labeled, "For when the theater opens again." In 1893, a professor of comparative mythology at Yale University received a series of unsigned letters, each containing pages from what appeared to be a ritual manual. But the diagrams weren't religious. They were surgical. One page showed a human spine stretched into the shape of an Ouroboros, vertebrae twisting in a perfect circle, the final bone biting the first. Another page depicted a pair of hands pulling threads from a child's femur as if unraveling memory like wool. The final page held no image, only a phrase in Latin, ut ossa loquantur. So the bones may speak. The professor archived the pages in a private collection. 1 year later he was found dead in his study, eyes plucked out, with a scalpel lodged in his throat. On the desk sat a note. "You tried to read it? That makes you one of us." That same year, a man named Victor Dalrymple, a traveling stage magician, began performing a show titled The Marrow Box. He claimed to conjure memories from volunteers on stage, events they had never lived but that left them weeping, trembling, even vomiting. He wore a ring with a Walsh family crest. Victor vanished during a performance in Baltimore in 1896. The curtain fell, and when it rose again he was gone. All that remained was a child's shoe and a journal, soaked in blood, with the words, "She walked in." She was humming. In 1900, the Walsh estate finally collapsed, or so it seemed. Locals said the roof caved in after a thunderclap. But when curious townsfolk climbed the hill days later, they found no rubble, no wood, no stone. Just soil, black and pulsing as if freshly turned. No one could say what happened to the structure. Some say it sank. Some say it was reclaimed. But a single iron bed frame remained in the center of the clearing, half buried in earth, and on it, a single intact book, its leather cover etched with a symbol never seen before. A fetus curled inside an open eye. Inside were no words, just pages and pages of spine drawings. And in the center fold, a lock of hair bound with thread. The book was taken. But the clearing, it remains. Locals still avoid it. GPS devices glitch near it. Birds refuse to fly over it. And those who camp nearby report the same dream. A woman in white holding a scalpel whispering, "You are what came after." Because the truth, Bruna, is this. The Walsh family was never buried. They were never truly exposed. They were transferred. Through blood. Through memory. Through marrow. And if the theater opens again, it won't need walls. We'll simply need a host. Aplogo, the Marrow Archive Aprox. 10.000 characters. Some stories end. This one persists. In 1932, nearly a century after the Walsh estate vanished from the maps, a train derailment near western Maryland unearthed something buried deep beneath an overgrown embankment. Rescue workers, searching for survivors, stumbled into a subterranean chamber, its walls lined with surgical tools rusted beyond use, and shelves containing hundreds of glass jars. Each jar held fragments, bone slivers, spinal cords, shreds of skin etched with ink, sometimes words. A few contained teeth suspended in yellow fluid, each labeled with initials and dates ranging from 1799 to 1874. And on the far wall, barely legible beneath layers of moss, was a phrase carved in Latin. Sanguis loquitur. Memoria mene. The blood speaks. The memory remains. The discovery was suppressed within 48 hours. The tunnel was sealed with concrete. The rescue workers were silenced. And the official record stated the chamber was an unregistered Civil War medical shelter. But one photo survived. A single image taken by a journalist before his camera was confiscated. The photo shows a small child-sized gurney. On it lies a perfectly intact femur, hollowed out and filled with writing. The writing was not in ink. It was in mercury. That image became part of the Marrow Archive, a classified collection of materials housed deep within an unlisted facility in Washington, D.C. Only a handful of people have ever seen it. Fewer understand what it means. Because the truth is this: the Walsh experiments worked. Not all of them. Not cleanly. Not predictably. But memory, emotive, psychic, generational, left imprints. Children born miles away from Elk Ridge began exhibiting traits they could not have inherited. Women with no surgical history bore scars of incisions never performed. Men recited medical procedures in their sleep. A violinist in France composed an entire suite that, when analyzed, matched the rhythm and cadence of human bone marrow extraction. No one could explain how. But those who tried disappeared. In 1957, a research assistant named Margot Winters smuggled copies of 3 journals from the Marrow Archive and released them anonymously in a pamphlet titled The Silent Inheritance. It was dismissed as horror fiction. Only 127 copies were ever printed. Each was found years later in strange locations. One inside a piano sealed shut for decades. One beneath a child's crib at an orphanage in Kentucky. One wrapped in gauze inside a coffin buried without a body. All 3 had handwritten notes added. Different handwriting, same ink, same words. We are all made of what someone else suffered. The phrase became the motto of a modern cult known as the Heirs of the Hollow. They operate online now quietly. They exchange bone samples, genetic data, audio recordings of infants crying in empty rooms. One forum post from 2006 claimed that a newborn in Bogota spoke the name Rebecca minutes after birth. Another post showed a baby's spinal X-ray that formed a perfect loop. The account that posted it was deleted instantly. Still, members of the group continue to ask the same question. Where is the marrow now? Because the estate may be gone. The family name may be buried. But the medium, the substance that held it all together, is still in circulation. Some say it's in the black market stem cell trade. Others believe it's in medical vaults, kept in stasis, waiting. And a few believe it lives in people, descendants, vessels, carriers of the old blood. You've seen them maybe. The ones who never cry. The ones who know things they shouldn't. The ones who flinch at lullabies. The ones whose shadows sometimes move out of sync. They don't know what they are. Not yet. But memory doesn't care what you know. It only cares that you carry it forward. So the next time you feel a shiver up your spine, the next time you wake from a dream that wasn't yours, the next time you bleed without a wound, ask yourself, is it your pain? Or are you just remembering someone else's? Because pain leaves a trace. And the marrow never forgets. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you want more buried stories brought to light. But be warned, some things don't stay buried forever.